Thank you, Mr. President. So a couple things about this bill I think it's important for the body to know, and my friend from Harford County did a good job of pointing this out on second reader particularly, and again reminding the body today that when we're talking about putting this into the statute under legally protected health care, same with what we did for abortion and abortive services, we are only doing this because we're saying that bring minors here. We'll do the surgeries, the operations. We'll prescribe the medications that can permanently alter their body, permanently alter their hormonal status, can block puberty. We'll do that here, and we want you to be able to come here and not have any state come in and find out what we've done. Now, despite how I feel about what I just said as far as those procedures and whether they should be done to minors, I can understand the temptation to say we don't want anybody's medical records being subject to search, seizure, or whatever. I think there's some things about this bill that are important to note. When we're talking about dealing with minors, what we've got is you're going to have situations where you have split custody, where dad wants something for Susie and mom doesn't, or vice versa. And if they're joint custody and one of them brings them here to do some of these types of procedures, to do some of this kind of health operations, health care, most of these states we're talking about that have restricted care for minors, they're not saying you can't get counseling and services and medication to help you with a hormonal imbalance. They're restricting in generally speaking, I'm sure there's some states that may have gone further, but a lot of these states have just restricted and said you can't do permanent things that a young person, a 12, 13, 14-year-old could live to regret. But putting that aside, what we're doing is we're going to put the state of Maryland in a situation where we'll get battles over people who brought a child here over one of other parents' wishes. You're also going to have an issue where you're going to have unaccompanied minors, people coming and saying, I've been emancipated. And I know our health providers are I know we require them to check those things, but it's just setting us up for a big mess. So I think that's a first warning that I would say about why we should vote against this bill. This is a lot different than a grown woman coming for an abortion or some type of reproductive service. These are children coming. But a little beyond that, we heard this during the hearing, and I heard it on the Senate floor Friday. We don't want to get into a re-adjudication of what these kinds of procedures are or what's appropriate. Well, it's interesting because nobody ever seems to want to ever adjudicate it. So I'm not going to get into all the different types of procedures that can be done, that are being done and being offered, and at tremendous profit for some health providers to minors. But what I will say is there is growing concern about permanent procedures that have permanent impact on young people who are in a very delicate state in their emotional, psychological, and physical development. I think we need to be very careful about it because we're not just talking, by the way, about 16 or 17-year-olds. We're talking about minors. In the gender affirming industry, the transgender industry, which has become a health industry now, there's a lot of concern that's developing, and it's not just here in the United States, it's actually developing all over the world. But there was a really interesting article in the New York Times last month written by Pamela Paul, and I would like to read a couple of things from that article. Grace Powell was 12 or 13 when she began to not feel comfortable in her own skin. She was unpopular and frequently bullied, and puberty made everything worse. She suffered from depression and was in and out of therapy. I felt so detached from my body, and the way it was developing felt hostile to me, Powell told me. It was classic gender dysphoria, which is a feeling of discomfort with your biological sex. Reading about transgender people online, Powell believed that the reason she didn't feel comfortable in her body was that she was in the wrong body, and transitioning seemed like the obvious solution. And the narrative she had heard and absorbed was that if you don't transition, you could end up killing yourself. This is from the New York Times. At 17, desperate to begin hormone therapy, Powell broke the news to her parents, and they sent her to a specialist to make sure she was serious. And in the fall of her senior year of high school, she started cross-sex hormones, had a double mastectomy the summer before college, and went off to college as a transgender man named Grayson, where she was paired with a male roommate on a men's floor. And at 5'3", she felt that she came across as a very effeminate gay man. At no point during her medical or surgical transition, Powell says, did anyone ask her about the reasons behind her gender dysphoria or her depression. At no point was she asked about her sexual orientation. At no point was she asked about any previous trauma. And so neither the therapist nor the doctors ever learned that she'd been sexually abused as a child. I wish there had been more open conversations, Powell said, who's now 23 and had detransitioned. But I was told there is one cure and one thing to do if this is your problem, and this will help you. And the article goes on to talk a little bit more about there's been a lot of political back and forth on these issues. And I know, speaking here as a Republican and from a conservative perspective, there are people who say, well, you're just inflaming this from a conservative point of view. But there's also been a radical far-out activism on the side from transgender activists that push an ideological extremism. And it's especially been that they've been pressing for a treatment orthodoxy that is facing increased scrutiny in recent years. And again, from the article, many who have in the industry that think there need to be a more cautious approach, there's including well-meaning doctors, people who've undergone gender transition and subsequently regret their procedures. They've been attacked as anti-trans or intimidated into silence their concerns. And Grace Powell said, what should be a medical and psychological issue has been morphed into a political one. And she said, lamenting during their conversation, it's a mess. Parents are routinely warned in these kinds of settings that to pursue any path and we hear this in the testimony in our committee on these bills. Any path outside of agreeing with a child's self-declared gender identity is to put them at risk for suicide, which is really a way to emotionally blackmail people. Proponents of the gender-affirming model have cited studies showing an association between that standard of care and lower risk of suicide. But the very studies that have been cited often have been found to have methodological flaws or have been deemed not entirely conclusive. In fact, a survey of studies on the psychological effects of cross-sex hormones published 3 years ago in the Journal of Endocrine Society, hardly a right-wing rag, the professional organization for hormone specialists found it could not draw any conclusions about death by suicide. And in a letter recently to the Wall Street Journal, 21 experts from 9 countries said that survey was one reason they believed there was no reliable evidence to suggest that hormonal transition is an effective suicide prevention measure. Now, I could go on with some other details from this New York Times article. It's really interesting, and I encourage people to look it up. But let me just conclude with this. Great Britain, Sweden, Finland, and Norway are all slamming on the brakes on pediatric gender-affirming care that's permanent. They're saying we need to slow this down. In fact, in England, the one clinic that does these kinds of long-term operations has closed now. And even France has recommended that puberty blockers, which is one type of treatment that young people will get, again, as young as 11, 12, 13, be defined as experimental. And I know there's this discord between some states that have gone to one level of banning these kinds of procedures and our state, which is sort of like, hey, come on in. Come and do as much as you'd like. I think we're going to look back in the day not too long from now. We're going to look back and say, what were we doing with permanent types of operations, procedures, permanent pharmaceutical changes to people's bodies when they weren't even all the way through puberty yet, or when they've in a very traumatic time as a teenager. And we're not, the industry, I can tell you the industry, and I know it's probably not everybody involved in the industry, but the industry's not asking enough questions when young people come to them. And I think it's very serious. And so, Mr. President, I'm opposing this bill. I mentioned some of the legal reasons, but I am opposing this bill because we need to stop the sprint down this road. Let's take some time, because all over the world, people are starting to question whether we have the right approach on these issues. So, Mr. President, my vote will be red, and encourage the body to vote red. Thank you.